hard knocks. So we're going to be talking about the difficulties that Liberals have had in the last year, 2 years. Nick knows a lot about the difficulties that Liberals have had in the last year or 2 years. He knows a lot about sudden reversals. And we're going to be drawing lessons from his experiences that are relevant to the specific issue of this conference for today. Nick, we talked briefly yesterday. I don't normally say this at conferences, but we did, because we were trying to draw out some themes that would be meaningful for the people in this room. And the first thing we talked about was the idea of a story that sees you through. So when you have difficulties, if you have a story that is either the story that you believe or a story that your group believes, then this allows you to move on through these difficulties. Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, it sounds a bit sort of trite and naff, but I think we are all sort of storytellers. As we go through life, we tell stories about ourselves, about other people, about our communities, about our families, and the same is true in politics. The most successful political parties, the most successful political philosophies are those which have a kind of story about where they came from, where they're at now, and where they're going. And I was just saying to you, as you alluded to yesterday, that I noticed that in the government of which I was a part, which was that as long as the then coalition government explained to people that the story of that government, if I can put it like that, was that no one had won the election, we were reeling from the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis, and therefore we needed to do something unusual, which was have a government of more than one party, as opposed to the traditional form of having one party, and put country before party. Then whether people agreed or disagreed with what was going on, they could at least understand the reason. I noticed that the moment that we stopped telling that story, and there was various complex reasons for that, I just think people then kind of lost the thread, really. They found it very difficult to follow, what was happening and why. And I think in politics and government that's especially important. If you're doing controversial things, as we had to, in my view, you have to spend a huge amount of time, much more time than we did, in explaining what the problem is first, so that people can go from where they are now to somewhere else. And I think so much of politics these days is very short term, very day to day, and as a result, politics has become desperately fragmented because people are failing to tell bigger stories about why they do what they do. Does that make sense? Do
you have to tell yourself the story too? Like after a bad day, do you remind yourself what it was you were doing it for, and what the... I don't mean story in the sense of a lie.
Once upon a time.
I mean the true story, why you're here, what you're doing.
Yes, I think we all do that, don't we? In all of our lives, you all go back home this evening and sort of, we don't, like anybody else, you don't sort of consciously and ponderously sit there thinking, now what have I achieved in my story today? But I think we all in a sort of semi-spontaneous way are conscious of, as we go through life, trying to kind of work out whether we're doing things that enrich our lives, that are in line with our values. I think everyone does that, to be honest, and I think that's just as true in politics and government as it is anywhere else. But I think the reason why it's so important in terms of the relationship between those who seek to govern and those who are governed is that you have to create a link between the two. You're asking people to follow and support measures which they might find difficult to comprehend or accept. And so the thread that binds the two is a story about where the country was, where it is now, where it needs to be. And oddly enough, I think whilst anyone who is in public life kind of knows that, and whilst the great PR industry and social media is, sort of envelops us every minute of the day, I think it's surprising how few good storytellers there are in public life, oddly enough.
Well, so one of the things that's come up a lot today in the workshops and also in the sessions is people thinking about, how do you change people's minds? How do you recruit allies? How do you make a business case? How do you work in countries where, gay rights are not well embedded at all, and that, in particular LGBT people may be harassed, it may be dangerous to speak to them. And it struck me, listening again and again, that people are probably more consciously than you thought you had to accept in politics, having to go home and tell themselves their story at the end of the day and say, I know why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because this is the world that I want to see, this is the world as it is now, I have a story for myself about how I'm going to get from here to there. Am I talking nonsense, or does this resonate with people? Stick your hand up if it resonates. Okay, we're hitting the mark. We're hitting the mark, Nick. We have to try better for the next one, though. Okay, so convincing people of the need to change. You skated past this there, but you mentioned it. Spending a lot longer talking about explaining what the problems are and why you need to fix them than you thought you had to.
Yes. Yes, David Cameron used to call it, in the sort of discussions you have, he used to call it rolling the pitch, which is a sort of very sort of public school crickety sort of thing.
I don't even know what it means.
Well, I think it means these great big rollers that you sort of isn't that what it means? I think it's what it means. So you prepare the pitch.
Oh, right, okay.
I don't play cricket. I have to say I find it a rather dull game, but so I would sort of nod and vaguely knew what he meant, but the analogy is that you have to prepare the ground.
Oh, okay. Know that expression.
If you want to do anything, and particularly if you want to do anything controversial. And we so happen to be in a government where I think we're inescapably condemned to do lots of controversial things, given what was going on in the public finances and the economy and so on. And the thing that I learned the hard way is that whilst it might be entirely obvious to you if you're immersed in this kind of stuff, if you're immersed in policy and political problem solving, it might be entirely obvious to you why you are, back to your story, why you are applying a particular solution to a particular problem, unless you spend a lot of time, and looking back on it, people like me should have spent a lot more time explaining what the problem was. If you don't persuade people first what the nature of the problem is, don't expect them then to uncritically accept a solution. And whilst that was especially dramatic in the context of a sort of, an economic firestorm after 2008 and the deteriorating public finances and having to do very controversial things in introducing savings to public spending and so on, I think one of the lessons I've learned with hindsight is that and I'm sure this applies in business as much as it does in any other walk of life, is that if you can do something which is going to be controversial, which isn't always going to be automatically welcomed, then spend much, much more time, double, triple, quadruple the amount of time you think you're going to devote to explaining the problem first. Most reasonable people, if they're persuaded there's a big intractable problem, will be prepared to go along with a big and even controversial solution. No one is going to go along with a big and controversial solution if they're not first persuaded there's a problem.
So one of the things we've seen in the last 2 years, I would say, particularly, is like this rise of populism, that people say that the elites, whatever they are, but certainly you're a member of the elite, I'm afraid, Nick, you don't listen. So it's even further back than you need to explain. So like if we imagine that you start by just doing the thing that you need to do and you think everyone understands, and then you say, oh, hang on a sec, I need to go further back, I need to explain what the problem is to people. Are we not going far enough back still? I mean, do we need to listen to their version of it first?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have an unfashionable view, I'm afraid, on this, which is, and I'm no longer a politician, and so hopefully it doesn't sound as defensive of the political class as it otherwise might. I think it's complete nonsense, a lot of this stuff about, certainly in British politics, that somehow politicians have no idea how. No, I mean, honestly, I really don't think you could find a group of 600, 650 people who spend more time immersed in local communities trying to understand what the problems that people are facing than MPs of all parties. And actually, I think most of our political system in this country is rotten and should be swept aside and replaced. But the one thing which is incredibly valuable, and boy does it keep politicians' feet on the ground, is it doesn't matter how high or low you are in the pecking order of politics, you have to be there on Thursday in your constituency surgery, listening to Mrs. Smith in 56 Orchard Close, who's having a dispute with her neighbour because of the overgrown Leander, and then speaking to a family about how you're going to help their daughter get into a local school, or speak to a single mum who isn't getting access to benefits and so on. This idea that the political class, and I have to say, and I don't, by the way, direct this at anybody in The Economist, but it is quite extraordinary the amount of times you see journalists from the comfort of their offices in West London, having never encountered a voter all their lives, pontificating about how politicians don't know how voters think. So I don't actually think it is a fair judgment at all. Does the political class then know what to do about the things they encounter? That's a different question. Do governments respond? But the idea that there's something, just the sort of dereliction of duty, I really, really think is and I know it's so unfashionable to come to the defence of politicians, so maybe it's easier for me to do it now that I'm out of politics. But I really think if we constantly accuse every politician of being an idiot, a charlatan, out of touch, bloodless, amoral, venal, well, then we'll get the politics, then you'll get this rampant cynicism where you just get this sort of chaotic politics where no one ever really gives anyone the benefit of the doubt. On the whole, in British politics, and by the way, it does distinguish British politics from other political systems, the vast majority of MPs I knew from all parties have a forensic understanding. I was an MP in Southwest Sheffield. Obviously didn't do my job good enough because I was booted out by them, but I was an MP for 12 years in the southwest bit of Sheffield, representing whatever it is, 65, 70,000 odd people. I mean, you know, most MPs, and I was not exceptional, atypical in this, sort of knew every blade of grass, every school, every street, every kind of street corner in their constituency. So I don't say anyway. There you go. There you go.
All
I'm
right.
defending politicians, not defending the system, but certainly defending politicians. And I don't think it's because they don't work hard enough to understand the people they represent.
Okay, so that was... I was put in my place there.
No.
I wasn't really. But to sort of go back to the... Did he make a face while I wasn't looking?
No.
Did he?
No, I didn't.
I bet you he did. I bet you he did.
I didn't.
Okay. So convincing people of the need to change and explaining the problems, giving that a great deal more time than you thought you had to.
Definitely.
And then the word coalition, you've already used it, so I can use it, even though maybe it's a word you never want to hear again. Internal coalition building as opposed to external discussion and action. The balance there. So you were within a coalition. Was enough time and effort put into keeping everybody on the same page, or conversely, was too much time spent internally compared with what was needed to be done externally?
So and again, I'm sure it's very, very similar to businesses. If you have a government or a political party which has to devote an abnormal amount of time trying to agree internally on what it's going to do, and a classic example is this government now, and I don't say this to any offence to Conservatives in the audience, but I mean this government is now basically dysfunctional because it is so immersed and gridlocked by its own internal contradictions. It can't even speak with one voice or any coherence. No storytelling is possible if you're constantly worrying about what Philip Hammond thinks of Michael Gove or Michael Gove thinks of Amber Rudd and so on and so forth. And so the rot in politics always starts usually sort of inside, if you sort of mean. And what I certainly discovered, which what I think you're alluding to, is that if you're running a coalition government, and in our case it was two parties, in other countries it's more, it's incredibly important that you have a method and a way of establishing internal consensus as smoothly as you can, so that you can then go and, if you like, sort of dispatch yourself to tell the kind of stories about what you're trying to do as a government as a whole. And all political parties, of course, are coalitions. All even single-party governments, as we've seen it right now. But look at the Blair-Brown years, where you had sort of government within a government around Gordon Brown. All governments are fractured by internal differences. But it was very, very striking that I think certainly for I can't put a date on it, but I would have thought for the 5 years I was Deputy Prime Minister, certainly for the first 3 years, we became pretty adept through endless conversations and bargaining and arguments and negotiations between myself and David Cameron, between George Osborne and Danny Alexander and Oliver Letwin and David Laws, and also layers of negotiation. I think we became pretty adept at most of the time thrashing this stuff out, so we could then try and explain to people what we were doing. But if you spend too much on the former, you can't do any of the latter.
But then if you don't spend enough on the former, you can't.
If you don't spend enough on the former, so it's a sort of internal external balance. Totally, yeah.
The last question I wanted to ask you about, or the last topic I wanted to discuss with you before I open it to the floor, is the role of bravery. So again and again today, we've heard people say, what should businesses be doing? What should they be doing if they might be putting their own people in danger? What should they be doing if it's going to get them booted out of a country where they lose a market? That sort of thing, You were so brave that you're no longer in politics. So, you know, you joined the government for the good of the country, and it led to electoral disaster for your party, and it led to electoral disaster for you personally. What would you have to say to... Yeah, I'm
nice
just
way of
saying
putting
it as
it,
it
isn't
is, okay?
Charming. Remind me to come here again. No, you're right.
Yeah, but
I know what you mean.
You know, you must have known when you made that decision that you were taking a risk,
Yeah.
and you gambled,
Yeah.
and you gambled, I think, I would say, for the benefit of the country,
Yeah.
but for the loss of the party.
Yeah.
Would you do it all again, and what would you say to businesses that are trying to make these
Sure.
high-risk decisions about bravery and how important bravery is?
Well, a couple of things I'd say. I mean, firstly, thank you in a sense for describing my motive. No, I'm serious. But actually, I think you're giving me too much benefit of the doubt. No. Let me explain. Of course, I knew that leading a political party that's never been in politics before, into government with our erstwhile sort of enemies, the Conservatives, at a time of financial crisis, but you know, was taking a risk. But I mean, let me be clear. I did so in the hope that you know, we wouldn't be annihilated sort of 5 years later. I did it in the hope that it would pay off. I had a view which I don't think is an act of bravery. Some people would say it was an act of foolishness, but I hope it was not an unreasonable one. That if you, broadly speaking, try and do the right thing, inverted comma, and I think we broadly didn't get everything right, of course, not made mistakes, but broadly speaking, in a half a decade period of time when governments across the European continent were, you know, toppling over like nine pins, when despite all the spine-chilling talk from George Osborne about austerity, actually the fiscal contraction in this country was much milder than almost anywhere else in the sort of stricken economies across Europe and so on, and we tried to do it as evenly and inverted commas progressively as possible. I kind of thought if you do the work in the boiler room and you do it to the best of your abilities, then the political reward will come through. So in a sense, it wasn't an act of bravery. It was clearly that calculation turned out to be wrong. As it, by the way, unfortunately, turns out almost always to be wrong if you look at the fate of smaller parties in coalition governments everywhere in Europe. For complex reasons, which I don't quite understand myself, smaller parties and coalitions tend to get the disproportionate blame for the bad stuff, because there's always bad stuff, and the other larger parties get the disproportionate credit for the good stuff. So it was a calculated risk as much as an act of sort of foolhardiness or bravery. The second thing I'd say is this, and I think if I may bring in the great sort of Brexit word here, because this is a rather good example. I have lost count of the number of chief executives and chairs and captains of industry of big British companies who say to me privately, this is a disaster, it's terrible for my shareholders, it's terrible for my customers, it's terrible for the economy, I'm going to move my plant there, I'm not going to proceed with the investment project here, it's idiotic, the negotiations are going nowhere, And then I say to them, well, say it, for heaven's sake, say it. Because one of the extraordinary facts, by the way, political facts in British politics at the moment, is that the party of business, the Conservative Party, which has a sort of quasi-constitutional role of being the party of business, is basically turned on the interests of business, but has paid no penalty for it whatsoever for two reasons. A, because business won't speak up, and secondly, because lots of businesses have persuaded themselves, in my view, foolishly, that Corbyn is a bigger risk to their interests than Brexit, which I don't believe to be the case. So I keep saying to them, you know, speak up, and they, well, I can't possibly do that. Our shareholders won't like it, our customers won't like it, the board won't like it. And then some of them are even more candid and say, I don't want to have my name dragged across, put in the, you know, the kind of crosshairs of this ghoulish, ghastly man, Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail. But this is the point at which of bravery, and I don't put it like this, and I don't, you know, and I understand all of that, but kind of like, okay, well then you'll get the decisions. Don't then blame the decision makers if you don't publicly, which is where it counts. Yeah. And then some of them say to me, no, but I met Minister X or Minister Y, really tore a strip off them. And I say, yeah, but you've got to understand, for a politician, and particularly someone in government, if someone tears a strip off them privately but says nothing publicly, they think they've got away with it. So I do think sometimes, and I think especially now, when we're taking right now in this country, pivotal decisions have been taken, which are not ordinary decisions.
Yes.
These are decisions which will set the tramlines of the way our country will function for years. I have to say I am starting to really lose patience with all of these alibis for a lack of courage or a lack of bravery. And do you know what? There comes a point where you just can't finesse exactly what you think it's going to do to your share price or your customers. You really just have to kind of think, I think this is so big, I'm going to speak out. And I just wish more folk would.
And I would add to what you said, you know, the sums aren't still done on the coalition government. Not
Right.
So,
No.
So I said, you know, you're annihilated and so on, and you accepted it with very good grace. But actually, perhaps I was too speedy. You know, we will look back from 2020 or 2025, and the verdict may be different. I hope I've asked questions that people feel link to the theme of today and that can give people some reflection as well as just being jolly interesting. But now's your chance. Questions. I see a hand up here before I even said questions were coming, so that's keen.
Thanks. Sir Nick, I'm David Pearson from KPMG. We think there's a strong link between social mobility and the opportunities available to LGBT people, because in often, you know, cases where LGBT people might be thrown out of home, for example, and not get access to education, and therefore some professions are shut to them. Do you think that there's more that could be done to support social mobility programs, and is that the responsibility of government or of business?
Well, both. I so happen to be chair of an excellent organisation called the Social Mobility Foundation that is the only nationwide organisation now that doesn't just talk about social mobility or publish research about social mobility, but takes a cohort of around 1,500 kids from the poorest families, but with the sort of brightest academic record, and then works with them over many, many years, 7-8 years, to get them first into the universities of their choice and then to help them get into the professions of their choice. It's painstaking work, because the sort of the headwinds which prevent social mobility, the ability for people to advance socially and economically regardless of the circumstances of their birth, are so great still. Class still plays a big role in this country. You've got the old, familiar distinctions between fee-paying schools and state schools. You've got where do people set their own ambitions and aspirations. A whole bunch of it. You've got prejudice, either openly or more often covertly stated. So I don't think it's for any one. I don't think it's for government or for civil society or for business. Everyone can do a whole. It can do a lot more. Government should not do stupid things which make it harder for people to get ahead. But equally, people shouldn't think that government can wave a magic wand and say we're now going to be a socially mobile society, because there is an almost an anthropological or cultural component, actually, to the reasons why social mobility does not operate as much as it should. So no, I mean it's a obvious thing to say, but it's worth stressing. It's got to be a shared endeavour. I mean, the good thing is that we're talking about it now. The two big issues of public discussion, which I like to play, immodestly like to believe I played a small role in sort of raising the profile of them over the last 5, 10, 15 years or so, which have really changed over the last decade. One is social mobility. People sort of talk about it now in a way that was a term that no one was really familiar with even a few years ago, really. And the second, perhaps because in my time in politics it had a similar trajectory, was mental health. I remember asking Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister a question about mental health at Prime Minister's Question Time, and there was absolute stunned silence in Westminster. Oh my God, he's talking about mental health. I thought, ooh, yikes. It's a bit, ooh. And now everyone, thankfully, I mean, we've really, but on both, oddly enough, we're in a liminal period now where we're much more adept at talking about it, but the gap between the talk and the walk is vast on both.
I probably have time for one very brief question and answer.
Very brief answer, yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Hi, Nick from Pink News. I know your successor as MP for Sheffield Hallam, Jared O'Mara, and your successor as Lib Dem leader, Tim Farron, both met their downfalls because they said regrettable things about gay sex. Do you agree with Tim Farron's subsequent criticism and suggestion that the LGBT community needs to be more forgiving of people who say things that we don't necessarily agree with, but who are willing to work with us?
Great question, thank
lovely,
you.
Thanks. I hadn't heard what Tim Farron said about the LGBT community, so are you asking me to comment about a comment that he has made in terms which I've not heard. But, I mean, Tim will not be surprised to know that I just flatly and staunchly disagree with his described attitude towards same-sex relationships, and so of course people should be tolerant. Of course people should be prepared to protect the right of folk to say stuff even if they don't agree with it. But I just so happen to think on this issue, but undoubtedly not on many, many other issues, I just don't think it was a particularly liberal way of looking at things.
But what about somebody in a sort of general hypothetical sense then? So you're gay, or you're a gay ally, or you're LGBT, whatever word you want to use, and then somebody says, you know, I personally believe that's sinful, but they're very good in lots of other ways. So how would you, for example, defend to somebody the idea that you would vote for the Lib Dems, even though someone had said something like that, because broadly speaking, they're right about, say, Brexit, they're right about socially liberal attitudes, you know, and so on?
Well, everybody needs to choose, because no political party, no politician is perfect, and there's not a sort of carbon copy match usually between people's views. But I so happen to think, this is my view, that one of the acid tests of liberalism is not to cast moral. I'm not a man of faith and religion myself, but or to sort of pass theological judgment on how people, you know, conduct relationships. And I've always felt it's just a almost obvious touchstone sign of a liberal society if it allows people to love whoever they like and express that love and live out that love in whatever way they want, without anyone either inhibiting them or passing judgment on it. But there you go.
Okay. Well, I don't think anyone in this room disagrees with that. Thank you so much.